On January 26, 1947, a routine flight from Copenhagen crashed just moments after takeoff. On board was Prince Gustaf Adolf, the handsome, athletic heir to the Swedish throne. His sudden death at age 40 not only devastated a nation, but left his infant son, the current king of Sweden, to grow up fatherless. But the story of the plane crash is only the final tragic chapter of a life filled with controversy. This is the story of the king who never was, a man whose legacy is caught between his idyllic public image and persistent whispers of Nazi sympathies. But before he was a controversial figure, caught in the storms of war, he was the golden heir to a changing kingdom. To truly understand the man, we must first understand the paradise he inherited and the paradise he lost. That story begins not with politics, but with his mother. Into this changing world, his father, the future King Gustaf VI Adolf, brought a breath of fresh air. Princess Margaret of Connaught, a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. Known affectionately as Daisy, she introduced a more modern, informal style to the rigid court. She loved sports and the outdoors and believed that even royal children deserved a life filled with play and affection. It was into this loving home that the future heir was born. The prince was born into a Sweden grappling with its own identity. It was a nation in the throes of industrialization, where the monarchy's role was being challenged by a rising social democratic movement, and it was still adjusting to its new place in the world after the peaceful but painful separation from Norway in 1905. The boy was named Gustaf Adolf Oscar Frederick Arthur Edmund, but within the family he was known as Edmund. He was the eldest, and he was followed by a bustling nursery of siblings, Sigvard in 1907, Ingrid in 1910, who would one day become the formidable Queen of Denmark, Bertil in 1912, and Carl Johan in 1916. Their home was not the vast, formal royal palace, but the more intimate Haga Palace, a graceful villa set in a sprawling park. The key to understanding the pressures and privileges of Prince Gustaf Adolf's life lies in the unique and improbable origins of his dynasty. The Bernadottes weren't ancient royalty. They were founded by one of Napoleon's marshals, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. A French commoner, he was unexpectedly elected heir to the Swedish throne in 1810. In a stunning display of pragmatism that would become a family trait, he soon abandoned his allegiance to Napoleon, siding with his new country's interests to secure its future. Haga became the symbol of their childhood, a private world shielded by their mother's love. Princess Daisy designed the gardens herself, creating a giant playground for her children. She taught them English, planted flowers with them, and joined in their games. She believed in discipline, but also in the importance of laughter and freedom. Gustaf Adolf, as the eldest and the future heir, was of course subjected to a more rigorous education. He was drilled by private tutors in history, languages, politics, and protocol. The concepts of duty and responsibility were ingrained in him from his earliest days. From an early age, he exhibited the two defining traits of his character. The first was a profound sense of duty, a seriousness that seemed beyond his years. The second was an intense passion for physical activity, especially horsemanship. The stables were his sanctuary, a place where rank mattered less than skill and courage. It was on horseback that he could escape the pressures of being the heir, where he found a freedom that royal life could not offer. The childhood of Gustaf Adolf and his siblings at Haga was a happy one, a golden age of relative peace, while the world outside crept towards the abyss of the First World War. They had a loving mother, a devoted father, and a strong family bond. It was a paradise, but no paradise lasts forever. In May 1920, the Great War was over, but the specter of the Spanish flu pandemic still haunted Europe. Princess Daisy was now pregnant with her sixth child. She developed an ear infection, a common enough ailment. She underwent a mastoid operation, but complications set in. Sepsis, a blood infection, spread with merciless speed. On the 1st of May, on what was her 38th birthday, the heart of Haga Palace stopped beating. Princess Margaret was dead. Gustaf Adolf was just 14 years old. The death of his mother was the great fault line in the young prince's life. The light, the warmth, the laughter seemed to have been extinguished from his world. His father, the crown prince, already a reserved man, retreated deeper into his grief and his work, leaving his 5 orphaned children adrift in a palace that suddenly felt too large and too empty. For a 14-year-old boy, this was more than an emotional loss. It was a forced maturation. As the eldest, Gustaf Adolf was suddenly burdened with immense responsibility. He became the anchor for his younger siblings, a model of stoicism and duty, even as he was breaking apart inside. This pain forged him, hardening his already strong sense of responsibility, but it also robbed him of the last vestiges of his youth. The boy Edmund had died with his mother. All that remained was Prince Gustaf Adolf, heir to the throne, his heart already bearing the scars of a great loss. The golden age of Haga was over. A new chapter, one defined by duty, discipline, and the gathering shadows of a turbulent century, was about to begin. Grief does not exist in a vacuum. It must eventually give way to the demands of life. For a prince, those demands are absolute. With the warmth and informality of his mother's era now a painful memory, the life of the young Gustaf Adolf became one of structure, discipline, and duty. The grieving boy was sent away to be forged into a king. His education followed the traditional path for a future monarch. He attended Lundsberg, Sweden's equivalent of Eton or Gordonstoun, a place that prized stoicism and physical hardship as much as academic learning. From there, it was on to the Royal Military Academy and a commission in the prestigious Svea Life Guards. The military was a natural home for the young prince. It offered a clear hierarchy, a defined purpose, and an environment where respect, at least in theory, was earned through competence. He excelled, proving to be a dedicated and intelligent officer. But the Swedish officer corps of the 1920s and 30s was not a politically neutral environment. It was by and large a bastion of conservative, nationalist, and monarchist sentiment. There was a deep-seated distrust of the growing social democratic movement, which they saw as a threat to traditional Swedish values. Even more potent was a profound fear and hatred of Soviet communism. For many in his circle, the revolution in Russia was an apocalyptic event, and the Soviet Union was the single greatest threat to Sweden and to Western civilization. This deeply ingrained anti-communism was the lens through which many in the Swedish establishment, including the prince, would view the rising political forces in Europe. It's a crucial piece of context for the controversial choices he would later make. As he matured, he began to represent his country on the world stage. He was tall, handsome, and impeccably mannered, the very picture of a modern prince. He undertook tours of Britain and the United States, honing his diplomatic skills. Yet, those who knew him well described a man who was often shy in private, reserved, and more comfortable in a small group of trusted friends than in a grand ballroom. He had a dry sense of humor, but it was rarely on public display. The weight of his future role, compounded by his early loss, had created a man who was, above all else, serious. His life was one of duty, but a prince, even one so dedicated, still has a personal life to live, and a future king needs a queen. The search for a suitable bride would lead him, and Sweden, to the heart of a Germany in turmoil. Her name was Princess Sibylla of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She was, on the surface, a perfect match. Her lineage was impeccable. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was a German dynasty, but one with the deepest possible ties to the British throne. Queen Victoria's beloved husband had been Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The name had spread throughout the royal houses of Europe. To marry Sibylla was to reaffirm the Swedish monarchy's connection to this vast network of European royalty. But Sibylla's immediate family history was far more complicated and far more controversial. Her father was Charles Edward, the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and his story is one of the most tragic and cautionary tales of 20th century royalty. Charles Edward was born a British prince. He was the posthumous son of Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, the youngest son of Queen Victoria. He grew up in Britain, a favored grandson of the old queen, but through a quirk of inheritance, he was also the heir to the German Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. At 16, he was sent to Germany to assume his title, torn from his home and thrust into the heart of the German imperial system. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he was faced with an impossible choice. He was a British prince and a German duke. He chose Germany. He fought as a general in the German army against the country of his birth. For this, he was branded a traitor in Britain. In 1919, the British Parliament passed the Titles Deprivation Act, and he was formally stripped of his British titles, his dukedom, and his place in the Order of the Garter. The loss of his British heritage was a wound that never healed. Embittered, alienated, and stripped of his ducal powers after the German Revolution, Charles Edward searched for a new cause. He found it in the far-right nationalist movements that were festering in post-war Germany. He saw them as the only hope of restoring Germany's honor and fighting the perceived threat of communism. And he became one of the earliest and most ardent aristocratic supporters of an obscure, rabble-rousing politician named Adolf Hitler. This was Princess Sibylla's father. This was the family Prince Gustaf Adolf was about to marry into. Prince Gustaf Adolf and Princess Sibylla were married in October 1932, first in a civil ceremony, then a religious one, in her hometown of Coburg. The wedding should have been a joyous fairy tale event. Instead, it was a deeply unsettling political spectacle. By 1932, the Weimar Republic was in its death throes. The Nazi Party was on the verge of taking power, and Coburg was one of their strongholds, the first town in Germany to elect a Nazi mayor. The wedding became a propaganda opportunity for the burgeoning Nazi movement. Newsreels show SA brown shirts, the party's paramilitary thugs, lining the streets, their arms raised in the Nazi salute as the royal couple's carriage passed. The groom's father, the Swedish crown prince, was reportedly appalled and did his best to ensure the Swedish royal family maintained a dignified distance from the political displays. Gustaf Adolf himself seemed to navigate the situation with a kind of determined obliviousness, focusing on his bride and the ceremony. But the imagery was damning. The future king of Sweden getting married under the shadow of the swastika, with his new father-in-law, a vocal supporter of Hitler, acting as host. It was a public relations disaster, and it created a permanent association in the minds of many between the Swedish prince and the Nazi regime. He was bringing a German princess home to Stockholm, but he was also bringing with her the toxic political baggage of her family, a burden that would weigh heavily on his reputation for the rest of his life. For Princess Sibylla, the move to Sweden was the beginning of a long and difficult chapter. She left a large, boisterous family in Germany for a reserved, formal court in a country where she did not speak the language fluently. While the Swedish public was initially charmed by her beauty, she struggled to connect with them. Her natural shyness was often misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness. The press could be unkind, scrutinizing her every move and often reminding their readers of her German origins, which became increasingly problematic as the 1930s wore on. She found it difficult to navigate the rigid etiquette of the Swedish court and the nuances of the political landscape. She was, in many ways, an outsider. Judged by the press and viewed with suspicion due to her family's politics, Princess Sibylla found that her husband was not just her primary support. He was her only true ally. Their marriage was a strong and loving one, and their home at Haga Palace became more than just a refuge. It was the one place in Sweden that truly felt like hers. But the feeling of not quite belonging, of being judged and misunderstood, would follow her for many years. It was a private struggle, hidden behind the public facade of a perfect royal family. 4 years after his wedding, Prince Gustaf Adolf's personal passion would lead him back to the heart of Nazi Germany. He was a world-class equestrian, and it had been his lifelong dream to compete for Sweden in the Olympic Games. In 1936, the Games were to be held in Berlin. The Nazi Olympics were the greatest propaganda coup of the Third Reich. Hitler used the event to present a sanitized image of Germany to the world, a nation that was modern, powerful, peaceful, and unified. For 2 weeks, the regime's brutal anti-Semitism was hidden from view. The international press was courted, and visitors were dazzled by flawless organization and grandiose spectacle. For Gustaf Adolf, it was a chance to prove himself on his own terms, as an athlete. He was a member of the Swedish show jumping team, but he could not just be an athlete. He was the future king. As a visiting royal, he was a guest of honor of the German state. Diplomatic protocol demanded that he meet with the regime's leaders. He was photographed in the company of Adolf Hitler and other high-ranking Nazis. Most notoriously, he developed a cordial acquaintance with Hermann Göring, the bombastic head of the Luftwaffe. Göring, a passionate hunter, found a common interest with the prince and reportedly invited him on private hunting trips. These images, broadcast around the world, cemented the perception of Gustaf Adolf as a Nazi sympathizer. To his critics, it was irrefutable proof. Why was he socializing with one of history's most monstrous figures? Was it naivety? A simple adherence to protocol? Or was it something more? The truth is likely a complex mix. He was a guest in a foreign country, and snubbing the host would have created a diplomatic incident. He saw them as the only hope of restoring Germany's honor and fighting the perceived threat of communism. And he became one of the earliest and most ardent aristocratic supporters of an obscure, rabble-rousing politician named Adolf Hitler. This was Princess Sibylla's father. This was the family Prince Gustaf Adolf was about to marry into. Prince Gustaf Adolf and Princess Sibylla were married in October 1932, first in a civil ceremony, then a religious one, in her hometown of Coburg. The wedding should have been a joyous fairy tale event. Instead, it was a deeply unsettling political spectacle. By 1932, the Weimar Republic was in its death throes. The Nazi Party was on the verge of taking power, and Coburg was one of their strongholds, the first town in Germany to elect a Nazi mayor. The wedding became a propaganda opportunity for the burgeoning Nazi movement. Newsreels show SA brown shirts, the party's paramilitary thugs, lining the streets, their arms raised in the Nazi salute as the royal couple's carriage passed. The groom's father, the Swedish crown prince, was reportedly appalled and did his best to ensure the Swedish royal family maintained a dignified distance from the political displays. Gustaf Adolf himself seemed to navigate the situation with a kind of determined obliviousness, focusing on his bride and the ceremony. But the imagery was damning. The future king of Sweden getting married under the shadow of the swastika, with his new father-in-law, a vocal supporter of Hitler, acting as host. It was a public relations disaster, and it created a permanent association in the minds of many between the Swedish prince and the Nazi regime. He was bringing a German princess home to Stockholm, but he was also bringing with her the toxic political baggage of her family, a burden that would weigh heavily on his reputation for the rest of his life. For Princess Sibylla, the move to Sweden was the beginning of a long and difficult chapter. She left a large, boisterous family in Germany for a reserved, formal court in a country where she did not speak the language fluently. While the Swedish public was initially charmed by her beauty, she struggled to connect with them. Her natural shyness was often misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness. The press could be unkind, scrutinizing her every move and often reminding their readers of her German origins, which became increasingly problematic as the 1930s wore on. She found it difficult to navigate the rigid etiquette of the Swedish court and the nuances of the political landscape. She was, in many ways, an outsider. Judged by the press and viewed with suspicion due to her family's politics, Princess Sibylla found that her husband was not just her primary support. He was her only true ally. Their marriage was a strong and loving one, and their home at Haga Palace became more than just a refuge. It was the one place in Sweden that truly felt like hers. But the feeling of not quite belonging, of being judged and misunderstood, would follow her for many years. It was a private struggle, hidden behind the public facade of a perfect royal family. 4 years after his wedding, Prince Gustaf Adolf's personal passion would lead him back to the heart of Nazi Germany. He was a world-class equestrian, and it had been his lifelong dream to compete for Sweden in the Olympic Games. In 1936, the Games were to be held in Berlin. The Nazi Olympics were the greatest propaganda coup of the Third Reich. Hitler used the event to present a sanitized image of Germany to the world, a nation that was modern, powerful, peaceful, and unified. For 2 weeks, the regime's brutal anti-Semitism was hidden from view. The international press was courted, and visitors were dazzled by flawless organization and grandiose spectacle. For Gustaf Adolf, it was a chance to prove himself on his own terms as an athlete. He was a member of the Swedish show jumping team, but he could not just be an athlete. He was the future king. As a visiting royal, he was a guest of honor of the German state. Diplomatic protocol demanded that he meet with the regime's leaders. He was photographed in the company of Adolf Hitler and other high-ranking Nazis. Most notoriously, he developed a cordial acquaintance with Hermann Göring, the bombastic head of the Luftwaffe. Göring, a passionate hunter, found a common interest with the prince and reportedly invited him on private hunting trips. These images, broadcast around the world, cemented the perception of Gustaf Adolf as a Nazi sympathizer. To his critics, it was irrefutable proof. Why was he socializing with one of history's most monstrous figures? Was it naivety? A simple adherence to protocol? Or was it something more? The truth is likely a complex mix. He was a guest in a foreign country, and snubbing the host would have created a diplomatic incident. He also came from a class and a military background that saw a strong Germany as a necessary shield against the greater evil of Soviet communism. This does not excuse his actions, but it helps to explain them. He was operating under a political calculus that would prove to be catastrophically wrong. And to add a final bitter irony to the story, His Olympic dream ended in failure. In the team show jumping event, his horse refused to jump, leading to his elimination. He returned from Berlin without a medal, his athletic ambitions unfulfilled, but with his reputation permanently tarnished by association. Amidst the growing political darkness, there was a source of immense light and joy in the prince's life: his family. Back at Haga Palace, away from the treacherous world of international politics, a happy domestic scene was unfolding. In 1934, their first daughter, Princess Margaretha, was born. She was followed by Princess Birgitta in 1937 and Princess Desiree in 1938. A fourth daughter, Christina, would arrive during the war. The public was utterly enchanted. The four girls became known as the Haga Princesses, and their childhood was chronicled in a series of charming, officially released photographs. They were seen playing in the snow, having picnics on the lawn, and posing with their parents. These images were incredibly popular, presenting a modern, relatable image of the monarchy. They portrayed Gustaf Adolf not as a controversial political figure, but as a loving, hands-on father. This idyllic family image stood in stark contrast to the grim realities of the 1930s, offering the Swedish people a symbol of innocence and hope. For the prince, his family at Haga was his anchor, a private world of love and normalcy that provided a desperately needed balance to the immense pressures of his public life as the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe. The idyllic family life at Haga Palace was a fragile bubble of peace in a continent descending into madness. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, that bubble was burst by the roar of German panzers crossing the Polish border. The Second World War had begun. For Sweden, a nation that had not fought a war in over a century, it was a moment of supreme peril. Surrounded by belligerent powers, its very survival now depended on a desperate, precarious, and morally complex balancing act. The Swedish government, under the steady leadership of Social Democratic Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson, immediately declared a policy of strict neutrality. But this was not a passive neutrality of isolation. It was an active, heavily armed neutrality. A period of national emergency known as Beredskapstiden, or the Preparedness Years, was declared. Hundreds of thousands of men were called up from their farms and factories to man the nation's long and difficult-to-defend borders. Sweden was transforming itself into a porcupine, hoping to make the cost of an invasion too high for any potential aggressor. The threat came from two directions. To the south was the terrifying might of Nazi Germany. To the east, the unpredictable behemoth of the Soviet Union. This fear of the Soviets was deeply ingrained in the Swedish psyche. In November 1939, it became a terrifying reality when Stalin invaded neighboring Finland in what became known as the Winter War. The Swedes watched in horror as the tiny Finnish army fought a heroic but doomed battle against the Red Army. While Sweden sent volunteer soldiers and massive amounts of aid, the government refused to intervene directly, fearing it would drag them into a war with the Soviets. The fall of Denmark and Norway to a stunning German blitzkrieg in the spring of 1940 intensified the sense of claustrophobia. Sweden was now almost completely cut off from the Western Allies, surrounded by the Axis powers. The nation was walking a tightrope. Its economy became dependent on trade with Germany, particularly the vital export of iron ore, which fueled Hitler's war machine. Every diplomatic move, every trade negotiation, every ton of iron ore shipped south was a calculated risk, an attempt to appease Germany just enough to avoid invasion without becoming its puppet. It was a period of immense psychological pressure, a time of rationing, blackouts, and the constant gnawing fear that tomorrow the panzers would cross their border too. In this time of national crisis, Prince Gustaf Adolf, now a major in the army staff, threw himself into his military duties with an energy and dedication that impressed even his critics. This was not a ceremonial role. He was an active working officer, a genuine part of the military machine, tasked with defending the realm. His life became a blur of motion, traveling constantly across the country, from the dense forests of the Norwegian border to the frozen expanses of the north. He was a familiar sight to the thousands of soldiers mobilized during the Beredskapstiden. He was not a distant prince inspecting a parade. He was on the ground, observing training exercises, scrutinizing fortifications, and speaking directly with the men. He shared their bleak rations, endured the brutal cold of the northern winters, and listened to their concerns. This shared experience forged a powerful bond. Within the military, his popularity soared. He was seen as a true soldier's prince, a competent and serious leader who understood their world and their fears. He became a potent symbol of national resolve, a physical link between the royal house and the men standing guard on the nation's frontiers. For the prince, this was a role of clear, unambiguous purpose, a world away from the murky complexities of international diplomacy. He was a Swedish officer, defending Sweden. It was as simple as that, or so he might have wished. The most severe test of Sweden's neutrality, and the moment that would forever define its wartime legacy, came in June of 1941. On June 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise all-out invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the geopolitical map shifted. Finland, seeking to reclaim territory lost in the Winter War, joined Germany as a co-belligerent. Immediately, Germany presented Sweden with an ultimatum. They demanded permission to transport a fully armed and combat-ready infantry division, the 163rd, known as the Engelbrecht Division, from occupied Norway across Swedish territory by rail to Finland to join the fight against the Soviets. The demand was a flagrant violation of Sweden's neutrality. To agree would be to actively assist the German war effort. It would make a mockery of their stated policy and risk retaliation from the Allies. But to refuse was to risk an immediate German invasion. Sweden's military leaders were convinced they could not withstand a full-scale German assault. For 3 agonizing days, the Swedish cabinet debated in secret. The government was split. Prime Minister Hansen and his Social Democrats were vehemently opposed to the concession. They believed it was a step too far, a betrayal of their principles. But the military, the conservatives, and crucially the king, saw it as a matter of national survival. The 82-year-old King Gustaf V, Gustaf Adolf's grandfather, intervened decisively. In a tense meeting, he informed the government that if they refused the German demand, he would consider it a dereliction of their duty to protect the kingdom, and he would abdicate. The threat was a constitutional bombshell. It was unclear if he had the power to do so, but the political crisis it would unleash was undeniable. Where did Prince Gustaf Adolf stand? As a senior military officer and a member of the royal family, his opinion carried significant weight in the halls of power. All evidence suggests that he stood firmly with his grandfather and the military high command. His perspective was that of a soldier. Sweden was militarily weak, Germany was overwhelmingly strong, and the enemy of their enemy, the Soviet Union, was now Germany's foe. In this grim calculus, refusing the German demand was a suicidal act of moral purity. It was better, he and his allies argued, to bend neutrality than to see Sweden broken by war. Faced with the king's ultimatum and the united pressure of the military establishment, the government crumbled. They agreed to the transit. The German trains rolled. Sweden's neutrality survived, but it was deeply compromised. The decision, known as the Midsummer Crisis, remains one of the most debated episodes in modern Swedish history, a stark example of a small nation forced to make an impossible choice in the shadow of a great evil. The Midsummer Crisis was a public concession, but it was Prince Gustaf Adolf's private activities that generated the most intense and lasting controversy. Throughout the war, he made several trips to Germany. Officially, these were for family reasons, attending the funerals of relatives or visiting his wife's family. But they were viewed with intense suspicion, both at home and abroad. His detractors, then and now, paint a picture of a prince who was fundamentally sympathetic to the German cause. They point to his aristocratic German connections, his father-in-law's Nazism, his cordiality with Goering in 1936, and his conservative anti-communist worldview. In this interpretation, his trips were not innocent family visits, but opportunities to act as a pro-German voice, a back channel for those in Sweden who believed the nation's future lay in accommodating rather than resisting the Third Reich. He was seen as the leader of a pro-German faction in the palace, a man whose judgment was dangerously skewed. However, there is another, more charitable interpretation. His defenders argue that he was, first and foremost, a Swedish patriot. They claim he was using his unique connections, his ability to speak with high-ranking Germans in a way that official diplomats could not, to gather intelligence and maintain lines of communication that were vital to Sweden's survival. In a world of existential threats, his actions were not those of a sympathizer, but of a pragmatist, doing what he felt was necessary to protect his country. He was, in this view, playing a dangerous game, using his German connections for Swedish ends. The truth, as it often is likely somewhere in the murky middle. He was a man of his time and his class who saw the world through a particular lens. He undoubtedly admired the German military's discipline and its effectiveness in fighting the Bolsheviks. But there is no credible evidence that he was a Nazi ideologue or that he ever worked against the interests of his own country. Yet, in the high-stakes world of wartime Europe, perception is reality. The shadows of his German connections were long and dark. And so, while Sweden emerged from the war physically unscathed, Prince Gustaf Adolf emerged with his reputation forever debated, his character defined by a controversy that would follow him to his grave. As the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, Sweden exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The nation had survived. It had walked the tightrope of neutrality for 6 long years and emerged, physically at least, untouched by the devastation that had consumed the continent. But the peace was accompanied by a quiet and uneasy moral reckoning over the compromises that had been made to secure it. For Prince Gustaf Adolf, it was a chance to step away from the shadows of wartime politics and embrace a future he hoped would be defined not by conflict, but by family. In the spring of 1946, in this new era of peace, the bells of Stockholm's churches rang out with a joy that resonated across the entire country. On April 30th at Haga Palace, Princess Sibylla gave birth to a son. After 4 beloved daughters, a direct male heir had been born. The future of the Bernadotte dynasty was secure for another generation. The birth of Prince Carl Gustaf was more than a family event. It was a moment of national catharsis. It symbolized a new beginning, a clean page after the dark and morally ambiguous chapter of the war. For Gustaf Adolf, now 40 years old, it was the fulfillment of his most profound duty and his deepest personal wish. Here was his son, the boy who would one day follow in his footsteps. Those close to the family remarked that they had never seen the prince so happy, so utterly content. The serious, duty-bound officer seemed to melt away in the presence of his son. He was a doting father, spending every possible moment at the Haga nursery. The controversies of the past seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the simple, universal joy of fatherhood. For 9 brief, golden months, the future of the Swedish monarchy seemed brighter and more secure than ever. It was a perfect, sunlit moment of peace, and it was the last he would ever know. In January 1947, Prince Gustaf Adolf traveled to the Netherlands for a hunting trip hosted by his friend, Prince Bernhard. It was a typical aristocratic pastime, a chance to relax and reconnect with friends after the long years of war had made such travel impossible. The trip was unremarkable, the conversations filled with talk of sport and family. On the morning of January 26th, after bidding his hosts farewell, the prince was driven to Amsterdam's Schiphol airport for his flight home to Stockholm. His flight was a commercial KLM airliner, a Douglas DC-3 registered PHTCR. The DC-3 was the workhorse of the sky, a famously reliable and rugged aircraft that had proven itself time and again. The flight plan was routine. A short hop from Amsterdam to Copenhagen's Kastrup Airport, a brief stopover, and then on to Stockholm. As the prince settled into his seat, there was no premonition of disaster. He was simply a man going home to his wife and his 5 children. The flight to Copenhagen was uneventful. During the stopover at Kastrup, as new passengers boarded, the ground crew followed a standard procedure for the windy conditions. They engaged the gust locks on the aircraft's control surfaces. A gust lock is a simple metal bar or pin that locks the elevators and rudders in place, preventing them from flapping in the wind and getting damaged while the plane is parked. It is a vital piece of safety equipment on the ground, but it is absolutely catastrophic if left engaged for takeoff. It renders the pilot powerless to control the plane's pitch. Somehow, in the series of checks and balances that make up a pre-flight routine, this simple, fatal mistake was missed. The flight crew, under pressure to maintain their schedule, failed to perform a final control check. They never realized their elevators were completely immobilized. At 3:35 p.m., the DC-3 thundered down the runway. As it lifted off, the pilots immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. The plane, its elevators locked, pitched up into an impossibly steep, uncontrolled climb. The pilots fought desperately with the controls, but the plane was unresponsive. It was being pushed skyward by the sheer power of its engines, but it wasn't flying. It climbed to about 150 feet, its airspeed rapidly decaying, until it reached the apex of its ballistic trajectory. It stalled. For a single, horrifying moment, the aircraft hung motionless in the air. Then, the nose dropped, and the DC-3 plunged vertically towards the ground. It impacted near the airport, the fuselage disintegrating in a massive explosion of fuel and flame. All 22 people on board, 16 passengers and 6 crew, were killed instantly. The world was shocked to learn that among the dead was the celebrated American opera singer Grace Moore. But for Sweden, the news that was about to break was of an entirely different magnitude. The news reached Stockholm first as a rumor, then as a horrifying confirmation. Prince Gustaf Adolf was on the passenger list. The nation was plunged into a state of profound shock. The prince, who had survived the political dangers of a world war, had been killed in a random, senseless accident. The hope for a new, peaceful era, embodied by the young royal family, was shattered. At Haga Palace, Princess Sibylla, waiting for her husband's return, received the news that would destroy her world. At 38, she was a widow. Her 5 children were now fatherless. The immense burden of raising the future king, a task she was meant to share with her husband, was now hers alone. She faced her private agony with immense public dignity, but the loss would cast a shadow over the rest of her life. The funeral was an outpouring of national grief. Sweden mourned the loss not just of a prince, but of a future. He was laid to rest at the Royal Cemetery in Haga Park, a short distance from the palace where he had known his greatest happiness. His death ripped a hole in the fabric of the monarchy and the heart of his family, a wound that would shape the destiny of his son, the 9-month-old infant who was now second in line to the throne. So how is Prince Gustaf Adolf remembered today? He is frozen in time, a tragic hero to many, the handsome athlete and doting father, a symbol of a future that was stolen. Yet, history cannot ignore the shadows, the controversial associations of the 1930s, and the difficult questions about his judgment during the war. He was a man of his time, caught between duty and the treacherous politics of an evil age. In the end, perhaps the truest measure of his life is the one he never saw. His son, King Carl XVI, Gustaf, whose long reign has been defined by the profound absence of the father he never knew. The story of Prince Gustaf Adolf is a poignant reminder of how a single moment can reshape a crown and how the loss of a father can echo through a kingdom for generations.